It was the coldest night of the year. She heard a weak sound outside her wooden door. When she opened it, she froze in shock. 3 giant horses stood there, barely alive, and what she did next would touch millions of hearts forever. High in the quiet mountains, far away from busy towns and noisy roads, there stood a small wooden cabin. It was old but strong, surrounded by tall pine trees and covered in soft white snow during winter. This was the home of a young girl named Sophia. Sophia had lived there alone for many years. She was only 20 years old, but her life had already been filled with pain and loss. Her parents had died when she was still a child. Since then, the mountains had become her only family. Life was not easy, but Sophia was brave and learned how to survive on her own. Every morning, she woke up early to collect firewood and melt snow for water. She cooked simple meals and kept her small cabin warm with the little wood she could gather. Sometimes there was not enough food, but she never complained. She had learned to be thankful for whatever she had. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also lonely. Days would pass without Sophia seeing another human face. The only living creatures she saw were birds flying in the sky and animals walking quietly through the forest. Sophia loved animals deeply. She felt they understood her pain without saying a single word. At night, she often sat beside her small fire, watching the flames move slowly. The silence around her was deep and heavy. Sometimes she wondered if anyone in the world remembered her. But deep inside her gentle heart, Sophia still carried kindness, warmth, and love. She did not know that one cold night, her life was about to change forever. That night was colder than any night Sophia had ever felt before. The wind howled through the mountains like a living creature, angry and restless. Snow fell heavily from the dark sky, covering the ground, the trees, and her small cabin in a thick white blanket. The temperature kept falling, and the air felt sharp and cruel. Even inside her cabin, the cold slowly crept in. Sophia sat close to the fire, pulling her old wool blanket tightly around her shoulders. The fire was weak, and the small pieces of wood burned slowly. She knew she had to be careful. She did not have much firewood left, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. The wooden walls of the cabin creaked as the wind pushed against them. The windows shook slightly, and the door made soft noises. Sophia tried to stay calm. She had lived through many storms before, but something about this night felt different. It felt heavier, stranger. She held her hands near the fire, trying to keep them warm. Her fingers were cold, and her breath was visible in the air. The silence between the sounds of the wind felt deep and endless. Then suddenly, she heard something. It was faint, almost too faint to notice. Sophia froze and listened carefully. At first, she thought it was only the wind. But then she heard it again. A soft sound. Not the sound of the storm. Not the sound of the trees. It sounded like slow movement outside her door. Her heart began to beat faster. She stayed very still, staring at the door. Then came another sound. A weak, gentle knock. Someone, or something, was outside. Sophia's heart pounded loudly in her chest. She sat frozen, staring at the wooden door. The weak knock had been soft, but it was real. She was sure of it now. Someone, or something, was outside in the middle of this terrible storm. For a moment, fear held her in place. No one ever came to this part of the mountains. No one even knew she lived here. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood up. The fire behind her crackled quietly, casting moving shadows across the small room. Another soft sound came from the door. It was not loud. It was not forceful. It sounded weak, tired. Sophia swallowed her fear and slowly walked forward. Each step felt heavy. The cold air near the door was even sharper. She reached out her hand and held the handle. It was freezing to the touch. She took a slow breath. Then she opened the door. The wind rushed inside immediately, cold and powerful, blowing snow across the floor and onto her feet. Sophia gasped as the freezing air hit her face. Her hair moved wildly in the storm. And then she saw them. 3 giant horses stood just outside her door. They were covered in snow and ice. Their bodies trembled from the cold. Their fur was frozen in places, and their breathing was slow and weak. Their eyes looked tired, filled with pain and silent pleading. Sophia stood there in complete shock. The horses did not move. They simply stood there, too weak to take another step. Snow rested on their backs, and ice formed along their faces. They looked like they had walked through the storm for a very long time. One of the horses lifted its head slightly and looked directly at her. Its eyes were gentle, but filled with suffering. In that moment, Sophia felt something deep in her heart. They were not dangerous. They were asking for help. She could see it clearly. They had come to her door for a reason. And they were dying. For a few seconds, Sophia stood there, unable to move. The freezing wind pushed against her, and snow gathered around her feet, but she did not feel it. Her eyes remained fixed on the three horses. Their bodies shook from the cold, and their breathing was slow and weak. They looked exhausted, as if they had used the last of their strength just to reach her door. Fear slowly faded from her heart. In its place came something stronger. Compassion. "Oh no, you poor souls," she whispered softly. Her voice was calm and gentle, even though her hands were shaking. She knew they were suffering. She could see it in their eyes. They were not here to harm her. They were here because they had nowhere else to go. Without thinking about her own safety, Sophia stepped outside into the storm. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and painful, but she ignored it. She moved slowly toward the horses, careful not to frighten them. "It's okay," she said quietly. "You're safe now." One of the horses lowered its head slightly, as if it understood her words. Sophia quickly turned back and rushed inside the cabin. She grabbed her old blankets, the only ones she had, and brought them outside. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but she forced herself to move faster. She gently placed the blankets over the nearest horse. Its body was freezing. She could feel the cold through the fabric. Her heart ached. "You must stay strong," she said softly. She knew she could not leave them outside. They would die in this storm. Summoning all her courage, Sophia guided them slowly toward the small shelter beside her cabin. It was not much, but it could protect them from the wind. She spoke to them constantly, her voice soft and comforting. Step by step, the horses followed her. They trusted her. Once inside the shelter, Sophia rushed back to bring water and the little food she had. She did not think about herself. She did not think about tomorrow. All she cared about was saving them. That night, Sophia made a choice that would change her life forever. The storm did not stop. The wind continued to roar through the mountains, and the cold grew deeper with every passing hour. But inside the small shelter beside her cabin, Sophia stayed close to the three horses. She refused to leave them alone. She lit a small lantern and placed it nearby. Its soft yellow light filled the dark space, creating a feeling of warmth and safety. The horses stood close together, their bodies still trembling. Their breathing was slow, and they looked weak, but they were no longer alone. Sophia moved gently, speaking to them in a calm and loving voice. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now. I'm here." She brought a bowl of water and held it carefully. One of the horses slowly lowered its head and drank a little. It was not much, but it was enough to give Sophia hope. She smiled softly, even as tears filled her eyes. She took a dry cloth and began to rub their frozen bodies, trying to bring warmth back into them. Her hands were cold and tired, but she did not stop. She moved from one horse to the next, making sure each one felt cared for. Hours passed. The night felt endless. Sophia had not slept. Her body was exhausted, and her eyes were heavy, but her heart would not let her rest. She knew they needed her. She sat beside them, her back against the wooden wall. The lantern light flickered gently. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, there was peace. She looked into their eyes and saw something familiar. Loneliness. Pain. Survival. She understood them. "I know how it feels," she whispered quietly. For the first time in many years, Sophia did not feel alone. These broken, suffering creatures had brought something back into her life. A purpose. A connection. She reached out and gently placed her hand on one horse's face. It did not pull away. It trusted her. And in that cold, silent night, Sophia made a promise in her heart. She would not let them die. Slowly, the long and painful night came to an end. The wind grew quieter, and the heavy snowfall finally stopped. A soft golden light began to appear behind the mountains as the sun slowly rose into the sky. The cold was still there, but something had changed. The darkness was gone. Sophia opened her tired eyes. She had fallen asleep while sitting beside the horses, her body leaning against the wooden wall. Her neck was stiff, and her hands were still cold, but the first thing she did was look at them. They were still there. Alive. She quickly sat up, her heart filled with hope. The horses were no longer trembling like before. They stood calmly, their breathing stronger and more steady. The ice that once covered their fur had started to melt. Their eyes, which had been filled with pain and weakness, now showed life again. Sophia felt tears fill her eyes. "You made it," she whispered. One of the horses slowly turned its head toward her. It looked directly into her eyes. There was something different in its gaze now. It was no longer full of suffering. It was full of quiet gratitude. Then something happened that Sophia would never forget. The horse gently stepped closer to her. Sophia stayed still, not wanting to frighten it. The horse lowered its head slowly and softly touched her shoulder. It was a gentle and peaceful moment. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She felt warmth spread through her chest. It was as if the horse was thanking her without using words. She raised her hand and carefully touched its face. "You're safe now," she said softly. The other two horses stood nearby, calm and strong. They were no longer helpless. They had survived. Sunlight entered the shelter, shining over them like a blessing. In that quiet morning, surrounded by light and silence, Sophia realized something deeply powerful. She had saved them. And somehow, they had saved her too. As the morning grew brighter, Sophia stepped outside the shelter and looked around. The storm had left the mountains covered in deep, untouched snow. Everything was quiet, peaceful. But something caught her attention. Marks in the snow. She walked closer and looked carefully. They were hoofprints. Many of them. The prints came from far down the mountain and led directly to her cabin. Sophia followed them with her eyes, trying to understand how far the horses had traveled. The trail stretched far into the distance. Her heart tightened. These horses had walked a long way through the freezing storm. Their steps were uneven and weak in places, as if they had stumbled many times. Some of the prints were deeper, showing where they had struggled to keep moving. They had been searching for something. For safety. For warmth. For help. Sophia looked back at the horses. They stood quietly together, their bodies calm now. The morning light shined on them, making them look strong and proud, but she knew the truth. Just hours ago, they had been close to death. She noticed something else. Marks on their bodies. Faint scars. Old wounds. Someone had hurt them. Someone had used them and abandoned them. Sophia felt sadness fill her chest. She could not understand how anyone could treat such beautiful and gentle creatures with cruelty. She slowly walked toward them and placed her hand on one of their necks. "You're safe now," she said softly. The horse closed its eyes for a moment, as if it understood her. They had walked through pain, cold, and fear. And somehow they had found her. Not by chance, but by hope. The sun had climbed higher into the sky, and the snow began to shine under its warm light. The air was still cold, but the storm was gone. Everything felt calm again. Sophia stood quietly beside the three horses. She knew this moment could not last forever. The horses looked stronger now. Their bodies were steady, and their eyes were clear. They no longer looked weak or afraid. They looked ready. Ready to leave. Sophia felt a deep pain in her chest as she realized this. Just one night ago, they had arrived as strangers, broken and freezing. Now they felt like family. She slowly stepped closer to them. Her hand gently touched the face of the nearest horse. Its skin was warm now. Alive. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered softly. The horse looked into her eyes. There was something in that look she would never forget. It was peaceful. Grateful. One by one, the horses began to turn. Their movements were calm and strong. They walked slowly away from the shelter and toward the open mountain path. Sophia stood still, watching them. After a few steps, one of the horses stopped. It turned its head and looked back at her. Time felt like it stopped. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. She raised her hand gently. The horse watched her for a few seconds more, then turned and continued walking. Together, the three horses disappeared into the bright white distance. Sophia remained there, standing alone once again. But this time, she did not feel empty. She felt full. Full of love. Full of purpose. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this was not truly goodbye. Sophia stood there for a long time after the horses disappeared. The mountains were quiet again. The wind had softened, and the snow rested peacefully on the ground. Everything looked the same as before. Her small cabin still stood alone among the tall trees. The sky was wide and empty. But inside her heart, everything had changed. She slowly walked back toward her cabin, her steps gentle and calm. The shelter beside it was now empty, but it did not feel cold or lifeless. It held a memory of pain, trust, and kindness. She touched the wooden wall softly, remembering how close the horses had been. How weak they were. How they had looked at her, asking for help without saying a word. And how they had survived. Sophia went inside and sat beside her small fire. The flames moved quietly, just like always. But she did not feel the same loneliness that once filled her nights. For years, she had believed she was forgotten. She had believed she was alone in this world. The silence of the mountains had often felt heavy, like an endless emptiness. But that night had shown her something powerful. She was not alone. Her kindness had mattered. Her presence had mattered. She had saved lives. And in return, those three broken, suffering creatures had given her something she did not even know she needed. They had given her connection. They had given her purpose. They had reminded her that even in the coldest and darkest moments, warmth could still exist. Sophia looked out the small window. The mountains stretched far into the distance, shining under the soft light of the sun. Somewhere out there, the three horses were alive. Strong. Free. She smiled, and a tear rolled gently down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of meaning. That night had changed her forever. She was no longer just a lonely girl surviving in the mountains. She was someone who had made a difference. Someone who had answered a silent cry for help. Someone who had chosen kindness when it mattered most. And deep inside her heart, she knew one truth that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes, the world does not send words. Sometimes, it sends souls in need. And sometimes, all it takes is one person, one moment, and one act of kindness to turn pain into hope, and loneliness into love.